let's set some expectations here. I want to talk about, and as I said, mostly when someone says let's set expectations, that means you're going to have to wait for something. And that is not wrong about this session. I want to do two things. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about things that are upcoming in a configurator for pdfToolbox 13. But then secondly, I also want to look at things that are a little bit further away for various reasons. And I'll explain why. I will also tell you what the plan is. And the reason that we wanted to share this already, even though we haven't really been working on this yet, in some cases, is that it provides you with the opportunity to also come up with feature requests or ideas that we might not have about. So, what are we going to talk about? Well, first of all, we're going to talk about the things that are coming to the configurator in the very short term. And when I say configurator, I'm actually talking about all the configurators for pdfToolbox in Switch. So the things that we are adding, there's a few generic things that I want to go over. And then there is also a small topic that is, that deals with license server. After that, there are some topics, like I said, that are a little bit further away, and that will be something about consolidation, something about configurators versus apps, and I will explain what the difference is as well, and then something about callas pdfChip. So let's get started. Before we go too far into the configurator for pdfToolbox 13, if I can call it that, I want to mention a topic that is a very common question. And that is, very often when there is a major version of pdfToolbox coming out, people ask, is there a configurator? When can we start using pdfToolbox 13, this new version in Switch? And actually, you can always start to use it immediately. There is no need for a new configurator at all. The configurator that works for the previous version of pdfToolbox is also going to work for the new version. It might not have access or easy access to all of the new functionality in that new version, but you will be able to use it. And in Switch, the only thing you have to do is right-click on the configurator in the list of Switch tools and configurators. And there will be the menu items, path to application, if I remember correctly how it is called, and you point that to the new version. And that should be sufficient to then have it work in Switch. When you do that, second biggest question we get in support, be careful to point Switch to the CLI application and not to the desktop application. You would be surprised how many people make that mistake. If you go to the pdfToolbox installation folder, in many cases you will have something called pdfToolbox at the highest level, and that is typically the desktop app. You have to look for a folder called CLI, and then the CLI app will be in there, and that is where you have to point Switch to. If you don't, you will get some very strange error message in the Switch log, because Switch doesn't know how to talk to the desktop application, only to the CLI. So in essence, you don't need a new configurator to start using this new version, but there will be a new configurator to make it easy to work with some of the new functionality in there. And what changes in there? Well, I have a summary of the changes. I wish I could say you can then just install the new configurator already and try it out. It was released. There was a compatibility problem in Switch, and at the moment, at least 2 of the 5 configurators are not available, and a new version needs to be made available for that. So you might have to wait a few days until Enfocus approves the new version of those configurators. But once they do, then you will get access to all of this functionality. So a few things have changed, mostly in the action configurator. For example, in Save as Image, as you can see there, you now have access to some new formats, color versions or color formats, whatever you want to call it. RGBA and Gray A, both for PNG and for TIFF files. What is RGBA? That is, and you can also see that in the desktop. RGBA is an RGB image with transparency. So instead of getting a white image with the page elements on it, you get a transparent image that has the page elements. So the background is transparent. And Gray A is exactly the same. It's a black and white version, but then with transparency in it. Other change is that you can also use the art box as the image box, which was not possible before. On the visualizer in the Actions configurator, there is an option to exclude processing steps, which is very similar to what Dietrich talked about in the last session. The ability to exclude any objects that are part of a processing step layer into the visualizer images that you can generate using that action. And then quick fixes were introduced in pdfToolbox 12, I believe. Quick checks were before, but quick fixes 12. Yes.
Okay, there's one question whether the new configurators are already written with the new Node.js API or the old API.
Should know better than I do.
Okay.
But as far as I know, that hasn't changed, because that would be a major change to the configurators. Also, if we would do that, I say we, but you, if callas would do that, go to the new Node.js API, then it would mean that the oldest version that would work in would be Switch 2020 spring, I believe, while the configurators right now go back a while further than that. So no, it has not changed.
It has not changed, but actually it was our intention to change, but then we had some discussions with Enfocus, very friendly discussions, and they suggested that we wait for their next update.
But that is something else.
Yeah, that is something else, but that would go together well. However,
it would go together
for the PDF, or the plan is to by then move to the new API, and for the pdfChip configurator that we plan to do.
Yes.
That is something David will cover in a second.
Yeah. But so what you have now, even the new versions of the configurators that are out or will be out shortly, those will still use the old API. Now, for you as a Switch user, unless I am mistaken, that should not make any difference. Yeah. Whether you write an app or a configurator using the old API or the old JavaScript environment or the Node.js JavaScript environment, if you're using Switch, that should not make a big difference. In fact, if it's done properly and you just want to replicate the behavior, then you should not see any difference at all. Okay, so like I said, Quick Fix was introduced in pdfToolbox 12. That was never added to the Actions configurator, and now it has been, so that is available now as well. Maybe another point to mention, in this case, like I said, the configurator always works with the newest version, but it might not have all the new functionality easily available. Even a missing action like Quick Fix, you still have ways of working with that through the command line parameter field that you have in these configurators. So you could have still done it, but now it has been added to the actions, and that makes it much more easy to use. In the last session, Dietrich talked about a number of differences for the compare configurator, or for the compare functionality in pdfToolbox rather, and of course these have also been made available in the configurator now. And there are two changes that you will see. The addition of additional comparison channels, and those are the comparison modes, if you want, that were introduced already in pdfToolbox 12. I'm talking about delta E comparisons, both delta E 76 and 2000. And then the new functionalities about pixel threshold and area threshold, and what was it, contiguous area, that has also been added to the compare configurator, so you can use that there as well. The functionality that no one commented on, but that I think is really great in this case, is the page ranges, and the fact that you can specify different pages or page ranges in file A and file B will also be there. And there are definitely cases where we will be able to use that to our advantage. Most of the things that are new in profiles and in process plans, well, we don't really have to do much to introduce that into the profiles configurator, because the profiles configurator runs a profile, so anything that is new in there will just be supported. There is, however, one new thing that was not talked about yet, and that is JSON reports. I will let you guess what that is. It's a report and it is JSON. I am not going to say more about that because Dietrich is going to talk about that on Thursday in the first session. That's the session about API and JSON technology. So much more detail will come there. But that thing is already supported in the configurator. Then one more thing I'm not going to talk about. This is becoming a very strange presentation with things I cannot talk about, but one more thing I cannot talk, or I will not talk about in detail, is page selectors. You could guess that there is some new functionality to select pages and page ranges. Much more information about that will come on Friday in the last session, and that function, the possibility to use page selectors, has been implemented in all the relevant cases in the configurators, everywhere where it makes sense, basically. So from a compatibility point of view, of course, everything will continue to work as normal. There will not be changes there. You just get a bunch of additional functionality that you can use if you need it in a workflow and you want to switch it on. Second topic is about license server. And again, a relatively small topic, but if you're using license server, something that is quite important, I believe. If you don't know what license server is, it is a separate callas application that can distribute licenses to the other callas applications. So avoid having to activate, for example, pdfToolbox or pdfChip on a specific machine. instead having pdfToolbox talk to the license server that will say whether and how many processes pdfToolbox can run. Yeah? In order to do that, pdfToolbox needs to be able to talk to the license server and needs to be able to find it. And in a Switch environment, up to this point, that was a little bit difficult. You could do it again through additional command line parameters, but that becomes easier because of an extra property. So this new configurator will have or the new configurators, it is in all of them, they will have a property called use license server that by default will be set to no, and that allows setting up one or multiple URLs for those licenses. So essentially, I can say, I want to use license server with pdfToolbox running in Switch, and then I have to tell pdfToolbox where those license servers are, which you would normally do by providing IP address or a network name and the port where they can be found. This is an example of the profiles configurator and the properties that you have in that profiles configurator. And there you will see one thing that I will not further talk about, which is the limit page range section, which was already there, but that now can also use page selectors. So don't look at that, but come back on Friday for that. And then license server, where you can say, I want to use license server, and then have an IP address where it can be found. There is no port there, which means it's the default port, but you can enter a port at the end of that as well. Again, for compatibility reasons, if you install these new configurators, the setting for license server will be no, which means it's just going to continue to work, and you have to switch it on specifically if you want to use. Okay, so much for what we are already working on or have already been working on and what should be released in the near future. And then now let's talk about some things that are a little bit further away for various reasons. The first one of that is a little bit of consolidation. That is often a good thing, but let's get specific. You look at Switch right now and you look at the configurators for pdfToolbox, you will find 5 configurators. Profiles, actions, and impose are the most common ones, I believe, but there is also one for compare, and then there is also one for convert colors. And these configurators have been there for many years, and they all in the background use pdfToolbox CLI. When I train people on using pdfToolbox or on Switch or the combination, I already told people for a long time that they should not use convert colors because it uses old technology, and they should do color management related stuff in profiles or process plans. And the plan is to indeed delete, to no longer have this convert colors configurator. The functionality that you have there is entirely replaced or replaceable by what you can do in profiles and process plans with convert colors, the map functionality for colors, and so on. Yeah? So there is anyway no good reason anymore to use that configurator, and the plan is to have it disappear. Along the same lines, having a separate configurator for imposition is a little bit weird, because impose in reality is just an action. So it would make much more sense to have this as part of the actions configurator. In fact, many of the imposition capabilities are already part of the actions configurator. If you look under actions, you will see things like step and repeat and the booklet functionality and fill page and so on. all of those use the imposition engine. There is not really a convincing reason why the impose configurator should be separate. So the plan is to move all of the impose functionality as another action in the actions configurator. Now, this of course causes some problems, and the problem is compatibility. It is very easy to remove a configurator and say that this is no longer going to be used or created, but what do you do with workflows that already use these configurators? And that is not a hypothetical problem. I have personally created many workflows that use impose, for example. And so the question is, will we have to modify all of them? The answer is actually no, and the reason is that we want to do this consolidation together with something else. And that something else is a move from configurator to app. That is what Dietrich was alluding to before. Yeah, so let's look at what that means. You've worked with Switch for a while, and you followed also the more modern versions or recent versions of Switch, then you should know that there are two concepts in Switch that can talk to external technology. The first one is a configurator, and the second one are apps. There are a few very fundamental differences between configurators. Typically are shipped with the application. There is an interface in Switch to manage them and get newer versions and so on via this pack manager. And then apps are not coming from there. They are coming from the Enfocus Switch App Store. Yeah? So there is a fundamental difference in how these two things come to Switch if you want to use them. That's one. Under the hood, both are very, very similar. If you look at a configurator that is typically written using JavaScript, technically, I think that Visual Basic is still supported on Windows, but most configurators probably use JavaScript. That is the same for apps. The API that a configurator uses to communicate with Switch is the same API that an app uses to communicate with Switch. So to go from a configurator to an app is a relatively small change for a vendor. Yeah? When you talk to Enfocus, the long-term plan seems to be a shift from using configurators to using apps anyway, and to have these things available in the Switch App Store. And when you look at the App Store, you will see that for some applications, there are some imposition-related applications, for example, that already integrate using apps rather than configurators. Okay. Together with that, there is a second transition that one can do, and that is what Dietrich said before, and that is a change from the old JavaScript model that existed in Switch since 2005-06 probably, to a newer model that exists since Switch, I believe, 2020 spring, and that is a JavaScript environment that is based on Node.js. This environment has a lot of advantages for developers who create the app, not necessarily people who work at Switch. Has a lot of advantages because it's a much more modern environment where we have access, as a developer, you have access to all Node.js modules, which makes it much, much easier to implement interesting functionality in these applications. But you still have to do work to go from one to the other. The old environment and the new environment are completely new, completely different. And that means that to just take the configurators as they exist today and then rewrite them using this new JavaScript environment, that probably doesn't make much sense. However, if you think about going from 5 configurators to 3 apps and then doing some consolidation and maybe some other cleanup and so on, then at the same time doing that switch from the old JavaScript to the new Node.js JavaScript starts making a lot more sense. So the long-term plan is that the pdfToolbox configurators would be discontinued. What that means depends also a little bit on how this is going to, how Enfocus is going to set this up to work. But discontinue does not mean that you will not be able to use the configurators anymore. It will just mean that there are no new versions of it. Yeah? At the same time as those are discontinued, the plan would be to release one app. Actually, technically, that is called an app bundle. That would be called pdfToolbox, for example. And when you install it, you would get 3 smaller apps in Switch that you can then use.
Yeah, there's one question, and that is whether so there is no possibility to copy and paste properties from a configurator to an app. So I assume this is for the ones who have created environment using configurators, whether there is any help for them if we do the transition.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't think there is a real restriction from copying and pasting properties from configurators to apps. It's rather that you can only copy and paste properties between things that are the same. So even between apps, the app has to have the exact same, I think, ID and even version to be able to do copy and paste. No. I think that is going to be limited for 2 reasons. A, because Switch doesn't really have support to allow us to implement anything like that, first of all. So it would be hard from a development point of view to even do that. I don't even think it would be possible somehow. But secondly, like I said, if you want to use this opportunity to look at the property set for the configurators and you want to move some things in together and so on, more than likely there are going to be some changes in the properties as well, and that again makes it possible. In all likelihood, you would have to add an app to a flow, and you would have to configure it from scratch so that it is set up. Of course, once you have set up one, you can then copy paste the properties of other apps, which is normally the way to do it.
So somebody else says it is possible to copy properties from a configurator to an app if both property sets are the same.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we heard this, and I think we understand that we should try to make it easy for you to do the transition with us.
Yeah. I would just like to caution people as well. Yes, it might be simpler to do copy and paste of these things. Then again, that would provide less freedom in trying to modernize what happens in the configurator or in the app as well. So this is always a two-edged sword, if you want.
Yeah. So maybe, I mean, and again, this is nothing that we alone can decide, but maybe a good way would be to have the 2 things in parallel, if at all possible. Yeah. So let's say up until the major release, there still are the configurators, but at the same time, there is an app to give you some time to do the transition. And then, of course, at one point, we won't do any bug fixes or such things for configurators anymore.
Yeah, and maybe important to note, and that was the next point I wanted to make, is that the timeline for this depends on 2 parties, which always makes it a little bit more uncertain. On the one hand, this is development work on the callas side, obviously. On the other hand, there is also Enfocus and the fact that they want to do this transition, but they want to make sure it can happen in an orderly fashion. And so the timeline depends on both parties. So at the moment, it has not been decided when this would happen. But once we know more about that, then we'll communicate about that, obviously. Yes? Okay. So that was for pdfToolbox. Now, most of this event, of course, is about pdfToolbox, but there are other applications that callas makes, and I will not talk about pdfAPilot because that's a completely different market. pdfChip is the same market, and up to now, there was no easy way to drive pdfChip in Switch, meaning there was no configurator. And that is at the same time, of course, a problem and an opportunity. It's a problem because if you want to do something with pdfChip in Switch, then you need to use the command line module in Switch, or you can write a custom JavaScript in Switch to do it. But there was nothing out of the box that could make your life easier. The opportunity, of course, is that because there is no configurator yet, there also are no transition problems if you want to be a little bit more modern. And so the plan is to create straight away an app instead of a configurator. That app would be called pdfChip. And there is a specification for it. I'm not going to share the whole specification with you, but the specification does exist. There are plans on what this app should do and should make possible. If you have an interest, talk to us and we will gladly share a little bit more information than what I am going to talk about right now. But so the plan is to make an app, and that app would be maybe a little bit more complex than pdfToolbox, because pdfChip, if you think about it in the context of Switch, is a little bit more complex than what pdfToolbox does. And pdfToolbox is pretty straightforward. You have an input file, which likely is PDF, but can be some other file formats, and you have an output file, and that's easy. Yeah? pdfChip has the complexity that on the one hand, you typically have an HTML template, and on the other hand, you need to have data, variables. And I've listed a JSON icon here, but however the variables come in, it's not that important, but you need to have data that is married with that template and then is used to generate a PDF document. When you think about that in a Switch context, there are multiple ways to implement that. And the app that is going to be created will allow you to use this in 3 different ways. Simplest way, that doesn't mean it's the most convenient or useful, but the simplest way is that you have a simple HTML file or you have a simple SVG. So one file that goes through the Switch workflow. And that HTML file or SVG file at some point needs to be converted to PDF. And then that conversion would be done using the pdfChip app. The mode that this app would be in at that point would be incoming is I expect a file and I expect that file to be HTML or SVG. Then there would be a property that would allow you to choose a JSON file that has variables in it. and the output would be the PDF file that is created. But it's a very straightforward way of using it. Somehow I have an HTML file and I send that to pdfChip to be converted. And if I want to, I can inject additional variables through this JSON file. Of course, in many cases, the template that you create for pdfChip is not going to be a single file. Probably in the majority of the cases, it is not going to be. It's going to be at least a folder where you have a full HTML template, meaning an HTML file, probably some fonts, probably some CSS documents to handle styling, probably a bunch of JavaScripts in there to make it dynamic. And so the second conversion way that this app will support is that a folder travels through a Switch workflow and encounters this pdfChip app. The assumption is going to be that there will be an HTML file inside of that folder. And again, there will be a property for the app that allows you to set a JSON file. And that JSON file could be used to get variables that are then used by the template and generate the PDF document. Not so much difference with the first case. The main difference is that here you're talking about single files that are pretty straightforward, and here you're talking about a more traditional full HTML template for pdfChip. And then, and this is what makes things a little bit more complex perhaps, is that there is a third way that you can use a pdfChip in Switch. And that is exactly the opposite of what you see here. And the use case there is, and this is probably the one that I've used the most with pdfChip, to be honest, in a Switch environment. That is the use case where what goes through a Switch workflow is not the HTML at all. What goes through the Switch workflow is a JSON file. How you get to that JSON file, not really important. You could start out with an XML file and have a script that generates a JSON from that or something like that. But at some point you have a JSON file and you want to convert that JSON file, the data in that JSON file, to a PDF using a template. So things are completely reversed from the first two use cases. In this case, there will be a JSON file that comes in to pdfChip. And there is a property where you can say, this is the template that you should be using to do the conversion, generate the PDF file. And that property would allow you to select a single HTML file for easy cases, but it would just as easily allow you to select a folder. And in that folder, again, you have a full HTML template that can be. Yeah. This is not too complex, but what you will see is that in order to make this work, in order to allow you to use pdfChip in all of these different ways in Switch, there are a few dynamic properties that will be, well, where the possibilities that they have depend on which of these processing modes that you select. But by providing these three processing modes, I also think that the app will be quite flexible in how it can be used, and that ultimately is the intent. Like I said, this has not been completed. It has not even been started from a development point of view. There is a specification for it, so we have an idea of what we think needs to be done. If you want more details, then talk to us and we can look at that. If you think that we are missing something in how that should work, or you've always wanted to use pdfChip in some workflow and you think that this would not be possible with what you just heard, then also talk to us and let's discuss that before the app is built. It's going to be much easier talk to us now and see if perhaps the specification can still change a little bit before development happens, than to do that once version 1.0 comes out. Cool, and that is what I wanted to share. So some present news, lots of future news, without, unfortunately, the real projected deadlines for these things. But at least that should give you an idea of the direction we're going into. And if there are any questions, we still have a little bit of time to answer that.
Just to that it is clear. So I mean, we started for the configurators, that it's definitely on its way. For pdfChip, we are, because it is really new, we are more open to hear. And then there already came a question related to that pdfChip app that we plan to do, and where we, with this meeting, just block Vincent from starting his work on it because he has to take care of our meeting. So that means after this meeting we will immediately start, but that also means he reads all your questions and remarks. Again, and there already is one, and that reads, what use cases triggered the idea with pdfChip?
In Switch, you mean? I guess so.
I guess he means with Switch. Yes.
Yeah, so I can tell you one of them that we kind of modeled partly the app after as well, and that was a customer who receives XML files for invoices. Where what was created first of all was a small script to split up each XML into a JSON file per invoice, because the original XML could contain hundreds of different invoices. So split it up into individual JSON files, and those were then converted using pdfChip to actual invoices that can be printed or sent to people. And we have one or two other projects where what is converted is different, but the way that it is integrated into Switch was very, very similar. In general, what I also tend to tell people is, okay, you have to look at pdfToolbox and at pdfChip. You have the pdfChip engine in pdfToolbox, of course. It is place content, and it is also used for pre-flight reports. So you have that same engine there. But if you want to generate documents from scratch, then pdfChip provides more flexibility, especially when you're talking about documents where you don't know ahead of time how many pages you want to generate. And the speed with which it can generate things in pdfChip is unbelievable. We did some tests with in Switch where the incoming data was a spreadsheet with barcode information, but like a big spreadsheet, like 100,000 lines. And what we generated from that was using a common background, an imposed sheet with labels on it, and each label had a different barcode and then the same number in the text somewhere as well. And the speed with which you can generate these imposed sheets, even if the incoming data set is 100,000 labels, is incredibly high. Those are the kinds of environments where pdfChip really shines.
So far, there are not any further questions. There was a remark earlier on when we started to talk about apps, and I just want to mention it, and that was a suggestion to consider to do that as an open source project, so that other ones could use what we have been doing in order to add to that. And I personally, as of today and right now, like the idea, so we will consider to do so. But that has various implications, including one that Vincent just wants to mention. Yeah, question is whether this should apply to both. Yeah, again, yeah. So we will consider it for both apps that we have in mind. pdfChip, again, is the first one to come. Yeah, again, I mean, I can't definitely commit to anything right now. The idea is new to me. We will have to look into that.
Yeah, it's an interesting it's an interesting suggestion, and I don't want to be negative, but we have had cases where we opened up certain things to general public. We have a GitHub repository, for example, with pre-flight reports and some other stuff in there. The downside of doing that is that, first of all, you then also have to maintain it and make sure that it remains up to date and so on. So that is
Yep.
The upside is supposed to be that other people indeed can take that information and then use it themselves and then also contribute. Unfortunately, for most of the stuff that is there, I believe we've seen absolutely very little uptake and contributions. So in general, I think it's an interesting idea, but to make it work in practice, it would mean that there is also some feedback from people and people work with it and actually use it. And I know for open source projects that can be difficult.
Yep.
It would also, of course, make it more difficult for support, and that I think that is something to keep in mind as well. Because if you end up with your own version of an app, then then coming back and saying this or this doesn't work becomes very difficult, because it could have been changed in all kinds of interesting ways.
Yeah.
So, interesting topic, but we should
Yeah.
discuss further. Yeah, I agree.
Fully agree.